We spend our lives chasing success, only to discover that what we were really searching for was peace. Behind every achievement, there's a story we're too afraid to tell. The story of who we are without the applause. He thought winning would make him feel worthy until the silence after the victory told him the truth. We live in a world that teaches us to measure our value by what we do, not who we are. From the earliest moments, we're conditioned to seek approval, to get the grade, make the team, earn the applause, and somewhere along that path, we begin to mistake achievement for love. Lewis Howes was no exception. Growing up, he learned quickly that performance meant praise, and praise felt like belonging. But underneath the trophies and titles, a quiet question kept echoing in his heart. Am I enough without all of this?
That question, though silent, is one that follows so many of us. We chase goals because we think reaching them will fill the emptiness inside. We imagine that once we achieve, we'll finally feel worthy of love. But worthiness doesn't live at the finish line. It lives in the space we often neglect, the space within. Lewis didn't know that yet. He believed that if he could just do more, win more, prove more, the ache inside would disappear.
His story began like so many others, driven, ambitious, hungry. But it wasn't hunger for success, it was hunger for validation. Every accomplishment became a way to say, look at me, I matter. The football field was his first stage, and with every victory came a fleeting sense of acceptance. But it never lasted, because the moment the cheering stopped, the silence returned, and with it, the fear that maybe he was only valuable when he was winning. We live in a culture that celebrates results, not reflection. We reward doing, not being. And so we learn to perform rather than to feel. Lewis carried that conditioning into his adult life. When his football career ended abruptly, so did his identity. Without the title of athlete, he was lost. Who was he, if not the person others admired? That question haunted him. The applause had stopped, and without it, he was forced to face something deeper, the truth that he didn't know how to love himself beyond what he could accomplish. It's a truth that many of us spend our entire lives avoiding. We fill our days with noise, with work, with endless scrolling, hoping to drown out the voice that whispers, we're not enough. We run faster, climb higher, thinking that if we can just reach the next summit, we'll finally find peace. But what happens when you reach the top and still feel empty? That's where Lewis found himself, on the surface successful, but inside disconnected and alone. Self-worth, built on achievement, is fragile. It shatters the moment failure arrives. Lewis began to realize that he was addicted not to growth, but to validation. Every goal achieved was followed by an immediate need for another, a desperate chase to feel seen. The more he achieved, the more hollow it felt. Because the truth is, no amount of external approval can fill the void created by internal doubt. It wasn't until he hit a personal breaking point that the facade began to crack. The hunger, he thought, could be fed by success had only grown stronger. He started to see that what he was searching for wasn't recognition, it was acceptance. Not from others, but from himself. And that realization didn't come in a moment of triumph, it came in moments of stillness, when he had no choice but to face his own reflection.
The hidden hunger for worthiness is universal. It's the quiet force behind so many of our actions. The reason we overwork, overcompensate, overextend. It's why we fear rejection and struggle with vulnerability. We've been taught to earn love instead of embody it. But love, especially self-love, was never meant to be earned. It was meant to be remembered.
For Lewis, the search began with admitting he was lost. That confession wasn't weakness, it was the beginning of truth. Because only when we acknowledge the emptiness can we begin to understand what it's asking of us. For him, it wasn't asking for another achievement or another audience. It was asking for presence. It was asking him to stop running long enough to see himself as he truly was. Flawed, imperfect, yet deserving of compassion. In every person's journey, there comes a point when the external no longer satisfies the internal. Lewis reached that point and discovered that worthiness isn't a prize to win, but a foundation to build. It doesn't come from doing more, but from understanding that you are enough, even when you do nothing. That idea challenged everything he believed about success. It meant letting go of the identity he had built and embracing the vulnerability he had avoided. It meant learning that love, real love, begins when the performance ends. The hunger for worthiness is powerful because it hides beneath good intentions. It disguises itself as ambition, drive, discipline. And those are beautiful traits until they become chains. Lewis had to learn the difference between striving from purpose and striving from fear. One brings fulfillment,
The other brings exhaustion. The moment he stopped chasing worthiness and started cultivating it from within, everything began to shift.
The irony of the search for self-love is that we often look everywhere but inward. We seek it in relationships, careers, recognition, but all along it waits quietly inside us, asking to be acknowledged. Lewis's journey revealed that self-love isn't about self-indulgence or ego, it's about honesty. It's about looking at every part of yourself, even the broken parts, and saying, you still belong. He came to understand that the hunger for worthiness is not something to suppress, but something to listen to. It is the heart's way of guiding us back home. Because beneath all the striving, all the proving, and all the pretending, there is a simple truth waiting to be remembered. You were enough before the world told you otherwise, and that realization is where every true journey of self-love begins.
There is a certain kind of mask that is harder to see because it looks like success. It looks like discipline, ambition, and drive. It looks like someone who has it all together, someone who knows exactly where they're going. But sometimes that mask is not worn out of confidence. It's worn out of fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being seen as ordinary. Lewis Howes wore that mask for years, and like so many of us, he didn't even realize he was wearing it.
The mask of achievement is one of the most convincing disguises in our world. Society rewards it. People praise it. We're taught that those who achieve the most are the ones who deserve the most. Love, respect, and admiration. But behind every achievement, there can exist a quieter story, a story of someone who believes that their worth depends on their results. For Lewis, that story began in childhood. Growing up, validation came from performance. When he played well, people noticed him. When he succeeded, he felt safe. But when he failed, it wasn't just a setback, it felt like rejection. So he learned to hide the parts of himself that didn't fit the image of a winner. He learned to project strength, confidence, and control. The football field became the perfect stage for that performance. Every touchdown, every victory became proof that he mattered. But what happens when your identity depends on your ability to win? What happens when you build your entire sense of self around something that can be taken away? The moment Lewis's athletic career ended, the mask began to crack. Without the game, without the applause, there was silence. And in that silence, the questions he had buried began to rise. Who am I without the achievements? Do I have value when no one is watching? Those questions are uncomfortable because they strip away the illusion that success can make us whole. The mask of achievement is designed to protect us from that discomfort. It tells us that as long as we keep performing, we won't have to face the fear of being unworthy. Lewis's journey through this stage of his life was a collision between the image he presented to the world and the reality he felt inside. Outwardly, he was still driven, still chasing new goals. But inwardly, there was a growing exhaustion, the kind that comes from constantly pretending. It wasn't that he didn't love working hard. It was that he no longer knew why he was working hard. Each success felt good for a moment, but the satisfaction never lasted. The applause always faded, and when it did, he was left with the same emptiness he had tried to outrun. It's easy to confuse confidence with armor. The world often celebrates those who appear unbreakable, but what we fail to see is that true strength isn't found in pretending we're fine. It's found in admitting we're not. The mask of achievement hides that truth. It convinces us that showing vulnerability will make us lose respect. It tells us that if we just keep producing, performing, and achieving, we can earn love and avoid pain. But pain has a way of finding us even behind the most convincing smiles. Lewis started to notice that the harder he pushed for success, the more disconnected he felt from others and from himself. Conversations became performances, relationships became competitions, and even moments of joy were overshadowed by the thought of what he needed to do next. The mask had become heavy, but taking it off felt dangerous. After all, who would he be without it? That's the paradox of the achiever's identity. It gives us validation, but steals our authenticity. Beneath the surface of his achievements, Lewis was struggling with feelings he had never learned to express: shame, loneliness, and fear of inadequacy. These emotions were buried under layers of drive and discipline, but they didn't disappear. They waited quietly, showing up as anger, impatience, and restlessness. The mask of achievement might protect us from others' judgment, but it also prevents us from healing ourselves. When we define our value by our performance, we forget that being human is not about perfection,
It's about connection. The more he reflected, the more he realized that his achievements had been serving a deeper, unspoken need, the need to be seen. But the tragedy of wearing a mask is that even when people admire you, they're admiring the version you created, not the person you truly are. That kind of love can never feel satisfying because it's not meant for you, it's meant for your disguise. The applause that once felt like validation began to feel hollow because it was directed at an illusion. As Lewis began to explore this truth, he started questioning what success really meant. Was it about having more, or about feeling whole? Was it about recognition, or about peace? The mask had given him power, but it had also imprisoned him. Every goal reached only reminded him how temporary external validation is. He began to understand that the real achievement is not in building an image others admire, but in uncovering the self that no longer needs to impress. The process of shedding that mask was not easy. It meant confronting the parts of himself that he had ignored for years. It meant acknowledging pain he had buried beneath accomplishment. It meant learning that vulnerability was not the opposite of strength. It was the foundation of it. Lewis's transformation wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow unraveling, a process of peeling back layers until he could see himself clearly again. The mask of achievement is seductive because it works for a while. It gets us rewards, respect, opportunities, but over time it costs us authenticity, peace, and connection. It turns life into a performance where every moment is judged by its outcome. Lewis learned that no matter how much he achieved, it could never quiet the voice inside that said he wasn't enough. That voice couldn't be silenced by success. It could only be healed by truth. Every person who has ever chased validation knows this feeling. The moment when the applause fades and the silence becomes deafening. It's in that silence that the truth finally has room to speak. The mask may have protected Lewis for years, but it also kept him from feeling fully alive. It kept him from experiencing the kind of love that doesn't depend on performance. And as he began to take it off piece by piece, he discovered something he had forgotten in the pursuit of achievement. That worthiness was never something to earn. It was something he already had hidden beneath the mask he no longer needed. There's a moment in every person's journey when strength stops looking like endurance, and starts looking like endurance, and starts looking like honesty. For Lewis Howes, that moment arrived when all the strategies that had once kept him afloat, ambition, discipline, achievement, suddenly stopped working. The image he had built began to feel heavy. The success that once energized him began to feel empty. What he thought was breaking down was, in truth, the beginning of breaking open. It was not destruction, it was transformation. And like every true transformation, it began in discomfort. For years, Lewis had been driven by the desire to prove himself. Every goal reached was a shield against vulnerability. Every success was armor against pain. But when his achievements could no longer protect him from his inner turmoil, he was left exposed to a truth he could no longer ignore. Strength without self-awareness is fragile. He began to realize that the walls he had built to protect himself were the very things keeping him from feeling whole. When those walls started to crumble, he faced not weakness but an invitation to open up, to feel, to confront everything he had buried beneath years of performance. Breaking open is not glamorous. It doesn't happen in front of cameras or audiences. It happens in quiet rooms, in the stillness of self-reflection. It's the moment when the noise of the world fades and you're left with your own voice, the one you've ignored for too long. For Lewis, this moment came after repeated cycles of burnout, frustration, and loneliness. On paper, his life looked perfect. He had the career, the recognition, the influence. But inside, he was exhausted. He was living in a way that looked like success but felt like survival. He began to ask deeper questions. What am I really chasing? Why do I still feel unfulfilled? Who am I without the validation of others? These questions didn't lead to immediate answers. They led to confrontation with fear, with shame, with long-buried memories. The pain he had suppressed for years began to surface, and for the first time, he didn't push it away. He listened. And in that listening, something powerful began to shift. He started to see vulnerability not as weakness, but as truth. It wasn't about breaking down, it was about breaking open the parts of himself that had been locked away. In one of his most revealing reflections, Lewis shared how difficult it was for him to even say the words, "I'm hurt." Growing up, he was taught that emotions made you soft, that men had to be tough, that showing pain was a sign of failure. So he learned to hide it, to channel every wound into competition, every disappointment into drive. But what he didn't realize was that emotional repression doesn't disappear. It transforms into anxiety, anger, and disconnection. The body keeps score and the heart remembers. It wasn't until he began opening up in therapy and honest conversations and on his podcast that he understood the healing power of expression. Breaking open meant allowing himself to feel everything he had been avoiding. It meant facing the pain of past failures, the fear of not being good enough, the guilt of trying to meet everyone's expectations. It also meant forgiving himself for the mistakes, the pressure, the endless striving. Forgiveness became the bridge between who he was and who he was becoming. Each moment of release was both painful and liberating, because the truth is, healing hurts before it helps. Growth feels like falling apart before it feels like alignment.
As Lewis allowed himself to be seen, not just the confident host or the successful entrepreneur, but the imperfect, uncertain, vulnerable human being, he began to attract a different kind of connection. People no longer admired him only for his achievements. They related to him for his humanity. That shift was profound. It showed him that true leadership doesn't come from appearing strong. It comes from being real. By breaking open, he discovered a deeper form of strength, one rooted in empathy, authenticity, and courage.
He also began to understand that pain is not the opposite of purpose. It is often its foundation. The cracks that appear when life feels unbearable are not signs of failure. They are openings through which light can enter. When we break open, we make room for healing, for clarity, for a new kind of peace that can only come from truth. For Lewis, this process redefined everything he thought he knew about success. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about surrender. It wasn't about proving. It was about accepting.
The transition from breaking down to breaking open is subtle yet powerful. Breaking down is the resistance, the fight to hold everything together even when it's falling apart. Breaking open is the release, the willingness to let go and trust that falling apart might be the beginning of rebuilding differently. Lewis's journey reflected this evolution perfectly. He learned that letting go wasn't losing control, it was gaining clarity. When he stopped trying to manage every outcome, life began to flow again. This period of opening brought him back to his core values: connection, contribution, compassion. He realized that his greatest fulfillment didn't come from being the best, but from being honest about what it means to be human. He began using his platform to start deeper conversations about healing, trauma, masculinity, and emotional intelligence. These topics weren't trendy or comfortable, but they were real. And it was in that realness that his message found its power.
Breaking open also changed how he viewed others. Instead of seeing competition, he began to see community. Instead of seeking approval, he sought understanding. He started listening more, judging less, and speaking from the heart rather than from habit. That shift rippled through every part of his life. His relationships became deeper, his work more meaningful, his sense of peace more grounded. Because when we break open, we don't lose ourselves, we finally meet ourselves.
Through this process, Lewis came to embody a truth that resonates with anyone who's ever felt lost beneath the weight of expectations. Strength is not the absence of struggle, it's the ability to stay open through it. The most courageous act is not holding everything together, but allowing yourself to fall apart and trust that you will rebuild stronger, wiser, and softer. Breaking open doesn't destroy who we are, it reveals who we've always been underneath the noise, the pressure, and the performance.
Lewis Howes learned that the heart doesn't heal by closing itself off. It heals by opening wider. By breaking open, he discovered that the pieces we once thought were broken are the very pieces that make us whole. Through vulnerability, he found freedom. Through honesty, he found connection. And through opening up, he found the strength to live not as a version of himself, but as the truth of himself. Redefining love as a practice, not a feeling.
There's a misconception many people carry about love, especially self-love. We treat it as a feeling that should come naturally, something that simply happens when life is good or when we've done enough to deserve it. But love, in its truest form, isn't a feeling to wait for. It's a practice to commit to. Lewis Howes learned this not through success, but through the quiet work of rebuilding a relationship with himself. After years of chasing validation and external approval, he came to see that self-love isn't born from comfort. It's forged in the moments when we choose compassion over criticism, when we show up for ourselves even when it's difficult.
For most of his life, Lewis equated self-love with achievement. If he worked hard, pushed himself further, or reached another goal, Maybe he'd finally feel worthy. But feelings are fleeting, and worthiness can't be earned through performance. When the applause stopped, so did his sense of peace. It was only when he began the deeper work, sitting with his emotions, confronting his pain, and asking himself what he truly needed, that he realized love wasn't something he had to wait to feel. It was something he had to practice, intentionally and consistently, especially when he didn't feel deserving of it.
Practicing love means showing up for yourself even when the mind tells you you're not enough. It means speaking to yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a friend in pain. For Lewis, this shift was radical. He had spent years mastering the external business, sports, branding, but he had neglected the inner relationship, the quiet dialogue between his mind and heart. That's where self-love begins. Not in accomplishments, but in how you treat yourself when no one's watching.
The idea that love is a practice changes everything, because practices require discipline. They require patience, repetition, and intention. You don't become loving overnight. You become loving through consistent action. And those actions often look small on the surface. Resting when you're exhausted, forgiving yourself for past mistakes, setting boundaries that protect your peace. But these small acts are profound. They are declarations that say, I am worth showing up for. Lewis learned that love was less about grand gestures and more about gentle consistency.
There was a time when he thought self-love meant confidence, positivity, or constant self-assurance. But that's not love, that's comfort. Real love is messy. It's the willingness to look at your fears without judgment, to sit with your insecurities without trying to fix them immediately. When Lewis began his healing journey, he had to unlearn the idea that love required perfection. He had to accept that loving himself meant embracing the parts of him that were still in progress, still uncertain, still healing.
This understanding came through experience, not theory. During his most vulnerable moments, he found that love wasn't a burst of emotion. It was a choice. The choice to forgive himself for his past. The choice to speak truth instead of hiding behind strength. The choice to listen to his body when it whispered for rest. The choice to say no to relationships or environments that diminished his value. Every choice became an act of self-respect, and every act of self-respect became an expression of love. He also began to see how love was connected to honesty. You can't love what you refuse to see. For years, he had been performing an ideal version of himself, strong, capable, unbreakable, but that version was incomplete. Real love demanded that he look beyond the mask to meet himself, where he truly was. It meant acknowledging pain without shame, vulnerability without fear, and imperfection without guilt. The practice of love is the practice of truth. Without truth, love is just a performance, another illusion dressed as comfort.
Through his conversations with countless guests on his podcast, Lewis discovered that nearly every person, no matter how successful, struggled with the same core issue, believing they were enough. He realized that success doesn't erase self-doubt, and fame doesn't replace fulfillment. The difference between those who find peace and those who don't often comes down to how they treat themselves in the quiet moments. Do they meet their flaws with compassion or with judgment? Do they practice acceptance or do they chase perfection? Those questions became the foundation of his personal philosophy. Love as a practice means you don't wait until you feel healed to be kind to yourself. You begin now. In the midst of the struggle, it means you keep showing up, even when you don't believe you're worthy yet. Because worthiness isn't something to earn, it's something to remember. Lewis started to build habits around this truth. Meditation, journaling, gratitude, open conversations. These weren't just routines, they were rituals of love. Each act was a quiet reminder that self-care isn't selfish, it's sacred. And yet the hardest part of practicing love is consistency. It's easy to love yourself when you're winning, but the real test comes when you fail. When you disappoint yourself, when plans fall apart, when old patterns resurface, that's when love has to be practiced most intentionally. Lewis learned that love was not the absence of struggle, it was the way he repented to struggle. When things went wrong, he stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What do I need right now?" That simple shift turned judgment into care, and care into growth. Redefining love as a practice also meant changing how he loved others. Before, love was about performance, doing things to earn appreciation or to prove worth. Now love became about presence, Listening fully, giving without expectation, showing empathy even when it wasn't convenient. The more he practiced love within, the more naturally it flowed outward. Because the truth is, we can only give the kind of love we've learned to give ourselves. When Lewis began treating himself with compassion, patience, and forgiveness, his relationships deepened, his work became more authentic, and his purpose clearer.
There's a difference between seeking love and becoming it. The former is a chase. The latter is a practice. Lewis's journey was about becoming love in action, through honesty, discipline, and care. He learned that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's setting boundaries that hurt in the short term, but heal in the long term. Sometimes it's walking away from something that looks good, but feels wrong. Sometimes it's facing your own reflection and saying, I forgive you. Every day offered a new opportunity to practice that. To redefine love this way is to reclaim power, because when love is just a feeling, we are its victims, waiting for it to appear helpless when it fades. But when love is a practice, we become its creators. We choose it. We cultivate it. We live it. Even when it's hard, that's the kind of love that lasts. That's the kind of love that transforms. For Lewis, this understanding became the foundation of everything he teaches, that love is not an emotion to chase, but a habit to build, a discipline of the heart, practiced one choice at a time.
Pain is a universal language. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've achieved, or how much success you've tasted. Pain finds its way into every life. For Lewis Howes, pain was both a teacher and a mirror. It reflected everything he had tried to avoid and everything he needed to understand. The journey that began with a hunger for worthiness and a mask of achievement eventually brought him face to face with his deepest wounds. But instead of running from them, he chose to listen. He began to realize that the very thing he had been trying to escape was the key to his purpose. Pain, when faced with courage and compassion, can become the raw material for transformation.
There was a time when Lewis believed that pain was something to overcome, to push through, to bury under success. He treated it like an opponent, something to beat, something to prove wrong. But no matter how far he ran, it followed him. The end of his athletic career, the breakdown of relationships, the moments of failure, all of it brought him back to the same place. The quiet space inside where unhealed hurt lived. He discovered that you can't outwork emotional pain. You can distract yourself, achieve more, build higher walls, but eventually the pain waits for you. And when you finally stop running, it becomes a doorway, not a dead end.
Facing that pain wasn't easy. It meant confronting memories and emotions that he had avoided for years. It meant admitting that behind his drive was a deep sense of unworthiness, that his achievements were often attempts to escape feelings of shame and rejection. But what began as confrontation soon became revelation. Pain was not the enemy. It was a signal. It was showing him where he had been disconnected from himself. It was pointing him toward the places that needed healing. As Lewis began to unpack his story, he saw how his experiences, both the triumphs and the traumas, were shaping something bigger than himself. He started sharing his journey publicly, first tentatively, then with growing courage. When he opened up about his insecurities, his fears, and his past, something unexpected happened. People listened, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. His vulnerability gave others permission to face their own pain. That's when he began to understand that purpose isn't found in avoiding your wounds, it's found in using them to serve others.
Pain transforms when it's given meaning.
The very stories we're most afraid to tell are often the ones that connect us most deeply.
Lewis discovered that every challenge he had endured carried within it a lesson about resilience, about empathy, about courage. Those lessons became the foundation of his work, his podcast, his writing, his mission. He no longer wanted to be seen as the man who had achieved everything. He wanted to be known as the man who turned his struggles into service. The stage changed from a field or a business platform to a microphone, but the message became more powerful than ever. Greatness is not about never falling. It's about learning to rise with purpose after every fall.
The process of turning pain into purpose isn't glamorous. It's raw, uncomfortable, and often lonely. It requires honesty, the kind that strips away illusions. Lewis had to learn that healing wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making peace with it. Forgiveness became part of his practice, not just forgiving others, but forgiving himself. He had spent years blaming himself for things beyond his control, punishing himself for not being perfect. But the more he leaned into grace, the more his pain softened into wisdom. That wisdom became the foundation for how he approached everything thereafter.
What makes pain transformative is not the experience itself, but how we respond to it. Lewis learned to stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and started asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" That single shift in perspective turned his pain from a source of bitterness into a source of insight. Every disappointment became data, every heartbreak became instruction. He realized that life doesn't punish us with pain, it prepares us through it. The purpose was never hidden from him. It was being shaped by everything he had endured. Through his podcast and his public conversations, Lewis began exploring how others turned their own pain into purpose. He spoke with athletes, artists, entrepreneurs, and thinkers, and the pattern was always the same. Those who embraced their struggles didn't just survive them, they used them to help others heal. It became clear that pain is the birthplace of empathy. Without it, we remain distant from the human experience. With it, we find connection. That understanding became the heartbeat of his message.
He often reflected on how the same pain that once isolated him now became the bridge connecting him to millions of listeners. His vulnerability didn't weaken his credibility, it amplified it. Because authenticity resonates more deeply than perfection ever could. People didn't want another story of effortless success. They wanted a story that made them feel less alone in their own struggle. Lewis's willingness to be open about his journey created a ripple effect. Listeners began to share their stories, finding power in their own healing. What had once been a private wound had turned into a collective awakening.
Turning pain into purpose also required redefining what success meant. It was no longer about reaching the top, but about lifting others as he climbed. Every story shared, every interview recorded, every conversation held was an act of contribution. His work became an extension of his healing. The very thing that once made him feel broken became the source of his strength. That realization transformed not just his career, but his sense of identity. He was no longer performing for approval. He was creating from authenticity.
Yet transformation doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means it stops controlling you. Lewis still felt moments of doubt, still wrestled with old wounds, but now he understood their role. Pain had become his teacher, not his tormentor. It guided him toward empathy, compassion, and clarity. It reminded him that every person he met carried invisible battles. And that purpose is not about avoiding suffering, but using it to bring light where darkness once lived. The search for self-love that began as an internal quest eventually expanded into something larger. Lewis began using his platform not just to inspire, but to invite others into reflection, to help them see that their pain wasn't a sign of weakness, but a call to meaning. Each story he told, each message he shared, carried the same underlying truth. When we stop hiding from our pain, we discover our power. For Lewis, turning pain into purpose became both a mission and a movement. His message evolved from personal healing to collective transformation. He understood that every person has a story that can help someone else heal, that our deepest wounds often hold the seeds of our greatest contributions. Through his openness, he turned suffering into service and service into significance. In doing so, he reminded us that the path to purpose does not begin in perfection. It begins in pain, in the willingness to face what hurts, to grow through it, and to give that growth back to the world.
The search for self-love is not a straight path. It is a lifelong unfolding. Through Lewis Howe's journey, we witness what it means to move from achievement to authenticity, from performance to peace. His story reflects a universal human truth, that beneath our ambition and our armor lies a simple desire to be seen, accepted, and loved for who we are, not for what we do. Each step he took, from confronting the hidden hunger for worthiness to shedding the mask of achievement, from learning to practice love as a daily discipline to transforming pain into purpose, became part of a deeper awakening.
It reminds us that self-love isn't born in moments of success, but in moments of surrender. It's built in the quiet decisions to forgive, to slow down, to listen, and to be honest with ourselves. The power of Lewis's journey lies not in his achievements, but in his willingness to face his truth, to sit with discomfort, and to choose healing over hiding. He discovered that love is not a reward for perfection. It's a right that every human carries, one we must remember again and again. What began as a personal search became a collective invitation to stop chasing worthiness and start living from it. To see that greatness isn't measured by how high we climb, but by how deeply we connect with ourselves and with others. Through his vulnerability, Lewis Howes turned his own search into a beacon for others still looking for home within themselves.
His message is clear: when we embrace our pain, when we drop the masks, when we make love a daily practice, we don't just heal, we lead. And in that journey, we discover that the greatest success is learning to love ourselves exactly as we are.